Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us for today's SwaggerHub webinar on adopting an API-first approach with OpenAPI 3.0. Today, we're going to be walking through what it takes to adopt an API-first approach in your API development, and we'll be walking you through some of the considerations for adopting an API-first approach, as well as looking at the importance of using the OpenAPI specification in your development. My name is Ryan. I'm joined here with Keshav. And today he's going to be walking through all of the best practices and actually showing a real demo of how you'd start designing an OpenAPI specification within the SwaggerHub platform. At this time, I'm going to pass off to Keshav. I will be on the line answering questions as they come along, but let's get started.
We're going to be understanding, first of all, what is the API first approach and why you should actually start thinking about even adopting such a framework or such an approach in your development. And from here, if potentially, if you're convinced that maybe you should start using this approach, that's when you have to get into the weeds of okay, so how do you actually adopt this in the real world? You have different organizational matrices, different hierarchies, different technological frameworks you're using. So what are the best practices when it comes to actually adopting this in the real world? Finally, we will be taking a deep dive into the OpenAPI 3.0 and showing a quick demo on how to actually design an OpenAPI interface using SwaggerHub and OpenAPI 3.0. So with that said, I hope we can start this webinar. So what is the API first approach? Well, this really is sort of like the textbook definition, if you can think about it. What the API first approach, sort of like the mobile first approach, where people advocate for building out a mobile application first, or like a mobile view of the product first before building out a full-fledged product suite. This sort of is the similar approach, which is where the company or the team or the developer actually thinks about building out an API first, makes that as a primary citizen of their entire product and service strategy, only after which they start developing their other additional products and services or on top of the APIs. Right. So this means really having that as a primary element, first and primary element of their product and service strategy, and building that API from the ground up that can be consumed in an optimal fashion by developers, by different clients, by different devices. But really, the API is the foundation for it. Now, I can talk more about the benefits of what the API first approach is. But before I do that, I actually want to take two real world settings as to why the API first approach is going to be helpful. But reason one is moving faster. Companies which have actually adopted the API first approach to move faster are Netflix, Facebook, Amazon, and these companies are gigantic companies. But one thing very common between them is, of course, their speed, but also how quickly they can move into different markets. So I'll tell you, to understand how this moving faster works, let's actually think about what it's like to be working in a monolith. And I'm sure a lot of people here on this line might have either are working on something similar, or they might have worked on something like this in the past, right? But traditionally, when you think about application development or product development, it usually starts with once you have the business objectives in place, your backend developers go in and build out the database and also the implementation that resides over this database. And only after this comes the API. Right, so the backend developers will use this API to expose their services that can then be consumed by front-end developers across multiple clients. Right, but this API acts as the center. Now, this is done in a traditional monolithic application. Now, you might think, okay, so what is wrong with this approach? Well, let's actually go one step lower into the entire application development monolith. Right. So if you think about it, your developers actually start building out your application code, as I showed before on the previous screen. And from here, they'll probably might be checking that code into a repository. And of course, as you check the code into a repository, you will be having an iterative cycle of testing between the repository. And once everything is done and once people are happy, you go in, you deploy the code, and then eventually you might get some happy customers. Right. But of course, as your application grows, as your product teams grow, as your developer teams grow, you will also want to start expanding your services. So if you have your first code base, which is code base 1, maybe the next team, whatever team that's building out additional services, will be reliant on the original code base. So they might have a version or a copy of that specific code base and start building out additional services. And then that also goes into to another customer or another client. And the same goes with Codebase 3, right? And so on. So you will have a stream of dependencies from the original code, which you've created, in order to expand and scale your application or your products and services, or even build up new features. The problem, however, starts when there's going to be an error, or say there's something which doesn't really fit into this whole framework. And that's when you'll have a nightmare of integration failures, right? And towards the end, it doesn't just result in a lot of bad spaghetti code, but also has a really negative impact on your consumer. And this could lead to not just loss in brand reputation, but also loss in customers, loss in revenue. Right. And this also, the other problem with this is that you won't be able to quickly go to market with new features, because again, as the dependencies increase, so is the complexity, and so will the time to build out new features. And there's always going to be dependencies between different teams. Right. So the API first approach advocates for a different sort of way of looking at your application development. Over here, you're not building out the back end. You're not even building out the front end. You're starting out with the API interface, right? So the blue over there on the screen is the interface of the API, the REST interface for that API, behind which are mock data. So there's no backend implementation yet. All we're doing is creating a REST interface and also some additional mock data to support this REST interface. And from here, your backend developers can come in and start building out the implementation logic that resides over a database. And your front-end developers can start working on different front-end applications, different views, different products, different services, all interdependent of each other, right? So client A, client B, client C can work parallelly. And similarly, front-end developers and back-end developers can actually work in parallel without having any sort of dependency on each other. And this becomes a very powerful way of moving forward. And in fact, some of the most famous companies, as I showed in one of the previous slides, actually have adopted this. In fact, Jeff Bezos has actually mandated this in Amazon. This is a famous Jeff Bezos mandate, which was released in actually 2002, which actually asks teams which actually mandates that every single team in Amazon expose their data through interfaces, through service interfaces, aka APIs. So this way, this allows different teams to actually communicate much faster while reducing dependencies on actual monolithic code, right? And this has actually resulted in Amazon being really agile for such a huge organization, and enter really different markets in a much more quicker fashion. Just recently, they entered the Etsy market. They have entered video streaming, and they've been very successful in all of those markets. A part of this is being very agile, and that comes from the actual code base. So what can you expect when you actually adopt an API-first approach? One is, of course, reduced interdependencies that allows teams to work at their own pace, because of which a byproduct of this is going to be faster development and delivery. So you can be rest assured that you're going to be getting features and bug fixes and really new products and services out there at a much faster rate, because different teams can actually work at their own pace without any dependencies. And it's also very easy to expand into different interfaces, different clients, different views, different devices, without much hassle, because you're exposing all of your data through APIs. As I mentioned before, there's going to be two reasons, right? One is, of course, moving faster, but the second is where the market is headed. And this is what we call the API economy, where APIs are actually not just the things that are restricted to the back end of your applications or allow you to expose back end logic. They're actually released to the market as full-fledged services, and companies actually and consumers actually consume these services in exchange for revenue, in exchange for retention, all sorts of things. So APIs are actually driving strategic goals. For example, companies like Twilio, Shippo, Stripe, they all release a lot of their services as APIs, and they have managed to become extremely successful. Some of which are have billion-dollar valuations as well. And we're seeing this not just in a few companies, but a lot in the market in general. There are over 100,000 public APIs as of now, and 85% of all enterprises will have an API by 2018. And if you think about what the API allows you to do from an ecosystem perspective, well, APIs allow you to build platforms. What do I mean by a platform? Well, think of a platform as anything which can be extended by an end consumer for additional functionality, right? A quick example of that is potentially Slack. If anyone's used Slack, Slack is a communication tool, but you can add multiple applications over Slack and expand its functionality. In my company, we use AI agents, AI assistants over Slack, calendars over Slack, all of which can be expanded over its additional existing functionality. Facebook has multiple games which exist over their existing product, and so on. So you can be rest assured that you can have different consumers come in and build products over your existing platform and build ecosystems that drive revenue to your ecosystem. And this is not an isolated phenomenon. In fact, if the entire GDP of the internet, the vast majority of them is driven by platforms. And if you can notice the yellow bar over here, that is driven by platforms. So platforms are a big component of driving sales to different companies in today's ecosystem as well. So quick, what this means is that APIs are no longer secondary citizens. They're no longer things you say, oh, I have a product or a service, let me just build out an API. It's really important to start thinking about your API strategy from the get-go, because 30% of the world's companies are trying to build digital ecosystems, and you don't want to be left behind. And so the big way to actually go about the platform ecosystem to leverage the economy we're in is to use APIs. So we mentioned the API first benefits. Well, the other benefit adding to the existing one is developer-friendly services, which can be exposed directly to your engineers or other third-party engineers to allow you to build platforms and ecosystems. Now, adopting the API first approach is a little, it's we might have sold you on the benefits of going API first, but adopting it is a different challenge altogether. Now, of course, some of you might be thinking, well, the API first approach seems nice, but I'm just a small team, or my product only exists in one view or in like one interface. I'm never going to expand probably in the next 5 years. If that's the case, even then the API first approach might be useful, because you never know where the market is headed. You never know what fixes that need to be done in today's competitive ecosystem for you to be very agile and for you to release some new feature into the market as quickly as possible. So if you're very confident that you will only be defined by one market, or you'll only be defined by one application product view, or like one device, or you'll only have 2 people working on your application, then probably the API first approach might not be beneficial for you, because it involves a lot of overhead. It involves a lot of resources for like long-term benefits. But for every other case, the API first approach is probably the best way to stay strategically competitive and very agile in a very hyper competitive ecosystem that we exist in. So that said, let's actually move into learning how to actually adopt the API first approach. I want to start off with the quote over here. Companies actually want to be agile, right? Companies want to start building out new services. Teams want to build out better features and products at quicker paces, but they don't take the drastic measures that are required to actually do this. Great quote from Einstein over here. And what it really means is that changing any approach is going to be hard. It is, and it involves not just a process shift. It involves even a cultural or mindset shift. So, API first approach really frees up organizations from the waterfall, deliberately engineered systems that follows a pre-planned orchestration platforms and allows products to grow organically and evolve. But to achieve this, you'll need to take some good measures. So these are some guidelines I've detailed over here. And again, these are just guidelines that are meant to inspire. And each of them, again, can be flexibly evolved and iterated in your organization, on your team, depending on your needs. So the first one is planning for the shift. Second one is conceptualizing the service. Third one is developing the service. And fourth is deploying and consuming the service. And I'll be detailing what I mean in each of these different guidelines. But just a quick disclaimer, again, these guidelines are meant to inspire, and each of these guidelines could have their own webinars or ebooks dedicated to them. For now, I just want to quickly touch upon them and make you start, and my hope is attendees here start thinking about how best they can adopt this into their organizations and teams. So let's go into the planning the shift phase, right? How does an organization or team actually plan for the new API first approach? Some of the topics we will be covering include setting up the team, how you should actually start thinking about setting up the processes, and also start thinking about setting up guidelines. Right? So let's start about setting up the team. It's really important to understand who are your actual stakeholders. By stakeholders, I mean you need an API product manager, especially if your API is going to be your primary first-class citizen. APIs are driving business objectives over here, be it internal APIs or external APIs, they are driving business objectives at the end of the day. So having that API product manager is really important. Having that API architect who can dictate how that API is going to look and feel is really important. And then developers and testers, depending on which type of organization you're in, are also equally important. So it's really important to identify who these stakeholders are, and then from there on identifying who the API's customers are. And customers aren't just like customers are very synonymous with like public facing APIs, but I'm talking about internal APIs as well. In an API first approach, every single API you're building has customers which are internal developers, right? And you need to make sure that whoever those internal developers are actually understanding what the API does so that they can build their services over them. And finally, of course, setting up governance teams. Think of governance teams as people who help you enforce processes, right? So your API needs to be compliant, and I'll talk more about guidelines and consistency, but your API will need at some point some sort of guideline to ensure that it is standardized across the organization. It is following the vision and mission of your organizational API portfolio. It is adhering to the specific frameworks that you're dictating. So the governance team actually gives the final green light to whether or not the API should be released out into your teams. So setting up that team is really important as well. And from there, setting up the processes. Now, of course, imposing a new process on developers by definition is new work, right? And processes are synonymous with bureaucracy, being slow, not being agile, but that really is important in an API first approach because process is unavoidable, especially for an organization that wants to scale, right? You need to understand that in order to successfully compete in the software development lifecycle, it's really important that you bake some sort of lightweight, realistic process into your development teams. The processes needs to be repeatable, so it shouldn't just be dedicated to a specific team. These processes need to be scalable, so different teams can actually come in and adopt these processes. Also, the goals which you set up in these processes should be realistic. Right? You shouldn't set up gigantic goals which your developers probably will not be able to enforce and will not be able to meet. And processes take time. Usually processes usually initially in the early stages, they're enforced top down, meaning a CIO or a CTO or a CPO comes in and makes sure that developers actually follow this. And the hope is eventually the process becomes a standard and actually helps developers actually create better quality APIs out into the market. So what do I mean as an example process, just to elaborate what I mean? This is something which is used by PayPal, right? So here, initially there's a proposal for what the API is supposed to be. Actually, I won't even use the word API. I think initially the proposal is for the business service. And from there, there's going to be a meeting to align all the stakeholders on whether or not this service actually makes sense in the broader business perspective or the broader business domain. And from there, this business service is then finally reviewed and given the green or red light, depending on the kind of service it is. After this is done, designing the interface, designing the service becomes priority number one. Remember, as I mentioned before, in the code-first approach, the API exists as a layer. It doesn't exist with the full app implementation. You're actually designing the interface first. So you design the API interface, and finally, you verify that it meets all the right requirements, the guidelines, and then finally you develop and deploy that API. So this is something which is used by PayPal. The next thing is, of course, You've set up the team, you've set up the process. Now it's important to set up guidelines as well. Why guidelines? Well, again, as your APIs are added to different portfolios, to your API portfolio, it's important to ensure that they're consistent with each other. And this consistency isn't just to ensure that your customers, who are your internal developers or your external developers, have a great experience moving from one API or one service to the next service. It's also useful because people who are actually coming in and starting to build out new services or new APIs within your company have a framework to start doing this. They have a foundation to start with. They have a source of truth, a guideline to go after this, right? So that way, everything in the organization moving forward is scalable. Everything in your organization moving forward, adheres to a certain pattern and can be fixed if there's any sort of issue in that specific pattern. Right? And finally, of course, designers will always face new issues when it comes to designing APIs. They are very opinionated designers by nature. So whenever they encounter an issue, they're not the only ones who are encountering that issue. Different designers would have encountered that. So you can actually, a design guideline will actually help them understand that they can actually solve those issues and they don't have to reinvent the wheel. Things you need to cover in your guidelines by default, some of the MVP of design guidelines, I would say, is security. What are the security patterns you enforce? What are the secure frameworks you support? How to name resources and responses, error handling, data format handling, and finally versioning. A good resource is to go to the apistylebook.com. This is a curated set of public API style guides. I would definitely recommend visiting this, where you can get some great examples on some public guidelines used by big companies like Atlassian, Google. I think Stripe is also one of them. A lot of companies. So please do visit that. So we just covered the whole planning for the ship, right? We covered how to just set up a team, set up processes, and setting up the guidelines. From here, we're going to talk about conceptualizing the service. So you've actually set up everything, set up all the required, set up the team and everything. Now it goes into how you actually, when you think about a new business or a new service, how do you actually conceptualize this? Right, APIs exist for a reason. This is where it's really important to take to have this consideration, right? The definition of it's really important for organizations to identify the scope of their business problem, to identify the scope of their problem space. One way to help ensure you're always building platform capabilities and not just small technological point solutions that don't scale is to clearly define the capabilities that compose your business. These become your problem spaces, and business capabilities represents this core. So every time, for example, you actually want to build out a new service or a new API, you actually have a sort of a bound of sorts to actually start putting in new APIs and mapping them into specific business bounds. So it's really important to identify what those high-level business bounds are. So for example, if you're a payment company, then your business bounds might be identity management, might be payment providing, invoice generation, those sort of things. And so you need to make sure that every new API that comes out sort of exists within these bounds, are not out of scope. Once you do that, it's the next level is determining why the API actually exists. What tangible outcome can the service actually bring to the overall business? What tangible outcome can the API bring to the customer? And finally, what tangible outcome can the service bring to an internal process? Right? These are some of the things you need to be thinking about, because again, these services are stable, business-driven, and not technological-driven APIs that exist. They shouldn't be isolated. They should be sustainable, and they shouldn't be solving specific small needs. You need to be thinking about the broader picture over here. So it's really important to have the top-down view of when it comes to API first approach. We actually think about the business and consumer need first, and then go all the way to the views or the clients, and then finally to the layer, which the API layer, and then towards the back end. That's the view we always recommend. Now, of course, once you've identified the purpose of your API, it's really, then comes the designing the interface part. So this is where we actually recommend the design first approach. And design first approach really means that even before your implementation logic is built out for your API, you're actually designing the API's interface first. So API first and design first go hand in hand, right? It's like the same exact reason why products are designed first before release. Same exact logic. Have that design thinking. And the reason for design thinking is because stakeholders have full visibility into what the service is supposed to do. With the API first approach, stakeholders are all automatically consulted in an attempt to collaboratively design, mock up, and document an API before the application or other channels even exist. So it really puts the business objectives or the consumer objectives of the API first before like just the technology. And the best way to actually design APIs is using something called the OpenAPI specification. So a lot of people here are here for learning about the OpenAPI specification. So the OpenAPI specification, think of that as an interface of sorts for actually building out your API service, right? So it helps you design the API. It helps you understand what the API is supposed to do. And I'll give you an example of the OpenAPI specification in the demo. But think of it as, again, there's no back end to this. You don't define any application code. All you do is you define what the API does, what is the requests, what are the responses. That's all there is to it. It's human readable, and really focused on making it human friendly. So even product managers who are not very technology focused can actually do this. And also, of course, it's machine readable as well. And it acts as the source of truth across your entire API lifecycle. So because it defines what your API does, everyone knows what the API is supposed to do, not just teams, not just your own internal teams, but also external tooling, because it's machine readable as well. So, having that design first thinking using the OpenAPI specification is extremely important, especially given that the OpenAPI specification is now the world standard when it comes to designing and documenting RESTful interfaces. Now, of course, I mentioned virtualization, even before building out the app implementation code. And it's really important because with the virtualization, just a quick definition of what virtualization is. Service virtualization essentially means that think of it as you're not even mocking up, but you're building out dummy data for your services that can then be used by multiple APIs or multiple resources in that API. And over in this specific case, then you're actually creating dummy data, which can then be consumed by your front-end developers as well as your back-end developers, making sure that both of them can now work in parallel without any dependency of on each other. So this way you save a lot of time, you can go to market faster, and you have full control on what sort of data gets transmitted as well. So this really is the approach we recommend. So again, conceptualizing the service, a quick summary is once you have the business objectives in place, once you have the business scope, you actually design the API interface first using the world standard for REST interface, at least the OpenAPI specification. And from there, you actually can virtualize the API's backend using some great tools that exist in the market, both open source as well as commercial tools. And we'll talk more about that a little as well. And that way you can then from here on start developing the service, which is our next topic. Now, I'm not going to be talking about this a lot just because it's just going to be one slide, just because this is a huge topic. But again, the whole purpose of this is to start making you think about how you should start building out your entire API first strategy, right? So if you think about developing the service, it starts with the OpenAPI specification. So the logo you're seeing on the screen is the OpenAPI specification logo. From here, you can design and document the spec, the API using SwaggerHub. You can virtualize the API using Service V. There's also other tools for both designing and documenting virtualization, but these are some of the most commonly used standard tools. And also, finally, you can develop, once you've built out the API interface, once you've mocked out the API's data, you can actually develop and test this using SOAP UI as well as some of the IDEs that exist in the market. And again, these are the most common tools which we see. There are other open source tools as well that exist. Finally, we'll talk about what it means to actually deploy and consume the service. Right? And this is, again, you might have built out everything. You might have built out a great API, but if no one's using that API, then that's a huge problem. So you need to ensure that whatever API you're building out, internal APIs as well, they have customers. You have people who are actually using them. And this takes a lot of time. And so that's why it's really important to have the catalog of an API. This piece of infrastructure is probably the most important. Given the scale of any large organization, you need to have a central place to consolidate all APIs, the documentation, the SDKs, and also the overall engagement process, right? And make sure that your internal developers actually have a central location to go in and discover APIs to build out their applications or build out their services. So you need to ensure that when you're actually deploying these services, they actually have a catalog for them. So some of the most basic MVP, as we call it, for a minimal viable product for catalog is supporting inventory of APIs, showing all the relevant versions of the API, showing collaboration and access, having collaboration and access control for these APIs, having the documentation, again, make sure that the document people can understand that documentation with SDKs, and finally have a feedback mechanism so that developers can actually give you feedback on what that API is supposed to do, on whether or not that API is working. And then this comes to our final section, final part, which is measuring maturity. The whole approach to building in an API first approach is constant self-improvement, right? You need to make sure that whatever new APIs come out actually are improving, and there actually is an effort from your teams to actually build out better services. So have a maturity model, right? Maturity is a measurement of whether or not the measurement of the ability of an organization to deliver. In this case, how reusable and how consumable an API actually is. So make sure that you actually have a maturity model in place, with an actual quantitative scoring. There are some great blog posts out there which actually help you create maturity models, and some criteria on like actually building out a maturity model for your API is, how accessible the API is. You can have some criteria over there. What is the speed to the first successful response? You can measure the time there and have like criteria for those times. And finally, like how readable is the documentation? Maybe do a quick qualitative survey on how readable it is and provide a quick score. So those sort of things are really important as well, and that becomes essential to actually having that constant self-improvement. So we covered a lot in this 30 in the API first guidelines. One is, of course, going high level, planning the shift, all the way then conceptualizing how this the new service which you want to build out, how do you design that, why you should go design first, design the service, and then virtualize that API service. Then you can actually develop the service, and finally you deploy that service to a catalog where people can discover it, and there's always going to be a constant stream of self-improvement for this catalog or for this API, so that people and that you can enforce using a maturity model inside your organization. So from here on now, let's actually dive right into get closer to our demo, right? But before we go into our demo, some of the things I want to start talking about is actually how do you actually put in an API first implementation using the OpenAPI specification. Right, some of the things we mentioned, which are very important: design first approach, continuous communication and collaboration, governance and guidelines, ensure that whatever API you're delivering actually adheres to a certain standard. Mocking and virtualization, ensure that your APIs are fully mocked out and virtualized even before the implementation is done. And of course, catalog and discovery. And these are really important things that you need to consider when you're approaching the API first approach. And the platform which the Swagger team recommends is the SwaggerHub. And this is built by the same team behind Swagger and the original OpenAPI specification iteration. Right? And it's an API design and documentation platform at its foundation, but it's really optimized for the API first approach, and it's really built for teams to drive consistency and discipline across their entire development workflow. What do I mean by this? Well, it's first of all, it allows for faster standardized design, meaning you can actually design APIs, but also make sure that they're consistent with what the company's guidelines are. You can ensure that these APIs are centralized, and there's actually all your internal and external stakeholders actually have a central location to discover and consume these APIs. And finally, we generate documentation. So out of the box from the design, you can actually generate documentation as well. So let's start designing an OpenAPI specification API right now. So again, remember, like this is a quick high-level demo. But let's start with the objective. The objective really is to design an API over here. Assume you're part of the smarter organization. The objective here is to design an API, an HR API that allows users to obtain information about employees or post information about new employees into the company's database. We have a team which includes API designer, documentation, a developer, and a governance team. So remember, the objective is to design an API for HR, the HR API, to get information about employees. So this is a high-level plan. So over here, you can get information. So it gives info for an array of employees over here. We will expose one or two query parameters, and we will define what the successful response payload is. And from here, we will be talking about and we'll also show you how you can define a post method, where you can actually put in a new post method and put in new information about an employee as well. So from here now, let's actually go into SwaggerHub. I will share my screen again. Hope everyone can see my screen over here. So this really is the SwaggerHub. So again, you can go to swaggerhub.com and log in for free. You can also start a trial for like some of our other pro features. But this is the interface you'll be exposed to as soon as you log in. Notice on the left section over here, the first thing you'll see is a catalog. If you're new to the platform, you'll see an empty screen over here asking you to create a new API. But because I've already used this platform a lot, you can see all the APIs which I've created or APIs which I've collaborated on. Right, so my username here is Keish92, but I'm also part of the Smart Bear Software organization on the left over here. And so you'll see a lot of APIs over here, which are owned by Smart Bear Software. This is where you can see the owners of the APIs over here. So right immediately into the box, you're actually seeing this catalog. You can be more granular. You can actually go to your specific organization over here. I have, again, over here, you'll see a lot of these organizations. So Forrester Demo, AVK, Swagger Tutorials, Tesla Demo. I just created all of these organizations. Usually in a real world setting, it's probably one organization that you're going to be a part of. And then over here, like you can see all the APIs that belongs to the organization that you have access to. Again, organization owners can actually give specific access control depending on the level of security they want to enforce within their teams as well. You can also search for public APIs. SwaggerHub allows you to actually host public APIs as well. So for example, over here, there's like user management API, which you can use. And these are public APIs. People actually want you to use these APIs. And so feel free to use them at any given point as well. So from here on, let's actually, if you recall, our objective was to create a new API. So I'm going to do that right now. So you can click on Create New, and then click on Create New API. And from here, you'll be shown a pop-up, which allows you to define that API more further. So I'm going to be creating an OpenAPI Specification 3.0 APIs. So remember, in SwaggerHub, you're designing a new API from scratch using the design-first approach. We support both OpenAPI Specification 2.0, which is a lot of people might be using that, and 3.0, which is relatively new. It is new. It's been around for about 2 months now, and SwaggerHub is probably one of the first platforms to support it. So in this case, let me actually go to 3.0. You can actually start from scratch, or you can start from a template. I'm going to start from scratch because we have specific objectives in our API first approach for the HR API. So HR API first. I'm going to call this HR API first, just so that it's easy. I'm going to call this 1.0.0. This is the version. You can specify the version number. You can give a title for this. So I'm going to call this the Smart Bear HR API. And then a description. Let me add a quick description. Actually, let me just add a description blah for now. I'll edit that as we go into the editor page. Then you can define the visibility of the API. Within SwaggerHub, you have the ability to either create a public API, which can be exposed to anyone, or a private API, which only you and the collaborators you add to that API can have access to. Always recommend creating a private API in the early stages, because you don't want to give access to make your API public when it's not ready. So I'm going to set this to public though, because again, webinar, and I want you guys to actually see this API. We also support auto mocking. I'm gonna keep this on now, and then the Smart Bear Software API organization owner. So the owner of the API is Smart Bear Software. Right. So now from here, let me actually start defining the API. So as soon as you come in, this is what you'll be seeing. 1 second. As soon as you come in, this is what you'll be seeing. On the left is where you can actually define the API, and on the right is the visualization of the documentation of the API. So now over here, what you can do is, if you notice over here, also one of the things I wanted to mention is that because we enable the auto mocking in the pop-up, you will see that the server has already been pre-populated with the mock, right? So there's an actual mock server in place out of the box in SwaggerHub. So let's start defining this API. First, let's give a high-level description of what the API does. So let's say an API that allows users to obtain info about employees in SmartBear database, or post info about new employees in database. Right? I just gave a high-level description of what the API does. And from here, you can actually, of course, give in more information as well. You can actually give information like terms of service, contact information, all sorts of stuff. So all of this is you can actually give all of that information as well in the OpenAPI specification. So I've given a terms of service, I've given some contact information, and also some license information about the API. So now from here, let's actually start defining our first endpoint, right? If you recall, in our planning stage, we mentioned that we will be having the employees resource. So I'm going to be exposing our first employees resource. And from here, I'm going to be having one method called the get method, which allows you to actually get information about employees within the organization. So let's define the get method. Notice that as I'm typing, it's giving me both intelligent auto correction, but also it's parsing the OpenAPI specification for errors. So this here is telling me that it is not fully compliant with the OpenAPI specification 3.0, and also gives me specific line items to actually take care of. So this is also really helpful when actually designing the API. So from here now, let's actually start designing the API. So let's give a description first. Description, obtain info about employees. Now let's start putting out the parameters, right? Over here, I want to define our first query parameter. Let's give it a name. Name, let's call it body limit. It's a query parameter, so we define this in. Oops. Let's give it a description. Amount of employees returned. And then from here in, oops. Here we define the type of response it is, right? So we define the schema. So here we say type, put an integer. Example of this is 15. We can also put in like minimum and max. Minimum here is 10, right? So now it's giving us an error saying that we need to add responses. Just quickly, I'll also add in another parameter. So I'll also add another parameter titled page limit that defines how many pages we need to have. You can actually specify in your query as well. So now it's giving me an error telling me that I need to have responses. So my queries are correct, but now I need to actually have a valid response. So actually, let's go about building that now. So let's go over here, put in my responses. And over here now I define my requests, which is the get, which is the parameters. Now I'm going to be defining my first successful 200 response. So again, notice what I'm doing here. I'm just designing the API, meaning describing what the API does, what are the API objectives, what are the requests, and what are the responses. There's no code in this. So even a product manager or even someone non-technical can actually go about designing this API without any issue. So from here now, let's define our first successful 200 response. Let's give a description. Description over here, successful response. And now we actually, in the OpenAPI Specification 3.0, there's a new feature that is called content negotiation, right? And if people who are used to Swagger 2.0, they might be used to like a regular response where they define the content after they've defined the response. Well, over here in Swagger 3, in OpenAPI Specification 3.0, you actually define first what the content is, and then define what you return in that specific content. So, for example, we have this content over here, and then over here I'm going to say application JSON, right? And over here now I define the schema, right? So my schema items, and from here I say type, which is array. I give, and then I define the items, which I give in this array. So what I'm saying over here is I'm going to be in the type of content I want returned is application JSON. And over here specifically, I want to be defining the type of items they will be getting in this array, which is made of JSON objects. So the items over here include, let's start defining the properties. ID, we're going to get the employee ID, right? So type integer, example 23. Then let's define the employee name. Type string. Let's give an example. Ryan Pinkham. And then from here, let's give the title of the employee title as well. This is also a string. Example of this is market manager. Right? So what did I do? I just defined, first I defined, well, the resource, which is the employees over here. I defined the method under this, which is the get method. I described what this get method is, and then I defined the requests that a consumer needs to do to put in. So the parameters, really, that's the request object over here, request body over here. Here I defined two requests, one that allows users to specify how many employees they want returned, and the other to specify how many pages they want this returned in. Finally, I define the responses as well. And over here, I define what a successful 200 responses over here. And over here, I define exactly what those objects are. Right? I click save, and it's giving me saying that the definition is so I think so. I'll save this over here real quick. Oops. Yeah. So right now, what I do, so what you're seeing over here is now the OpenAPI specification over here, right? So notice that on the right is where the API is actually fully visualized, and I've just defined my first get response over here. But of course, if you recall our initial plan, we wanted to also have post as well. So we can actually start defining our post method. So let's make sure that the indentation is exactly correct. So it's over here. Yep, so we're on the right indentation. We're by the way, this is YAML for those who don't know. And we're describing now our post method. So what it takes to actually create a new employee. And then now in the OpenAPI Specification 3.0, if you recall in the first, there was a body parameter in Swagger 2.0 for people who are acquainted with that specification format. Over here, we actually have a new form. That's the body parameter is actually replaced with something called the request body. So the request body allows you to define what goes into a post method. So what goes into that body which you send out to the API directly. So over here, I put in request body. You need to have required. It is required. So you put required true. And then you put out content for here. And content, let's put in application JSON. And from here now, let's define the schema that goes into actually, remember, this is the content negotiation part. So this is where I can actually define what content you want and what that content should actually contain. So from here, I'm defining the application JSON content, and then I define the schema over here. Schema, and then you can define the type, object, and then properties. So exactly the same thing we can just copy paste over here. Description here. That's body required content, application JSON. CHEMA, type object, properties. And then from here, let's define the responses. Right, so over here, responses, 200, and then give a description. Yep, it's actually valid. Quick page refresh actually helped, I guess. But yeah, so that really is, apologies for that. Maybe my server went down. But yeah, so I just created a post method, which allows you to actually post information about a new employee. Right, and SwaggerHub actually supports multiple things as well. Apart from this, we actually have the ability to mock. So we have an auto mock integration. We actually have more integrations, but because we're showing this in 3.0, so I'll show you, for example, if you do another API over here, you can actually add new integrations as well. We actually support a lot of integrations. You have support for the entire API lifecycle that goes all the way from source control syncs like GitHub integrations, GitLab integration, Bitbucket integration, API management integrations like Azure, AWS, Apigee, IBM, to even a style validator, right? Remember I spoke about guidelines and how guidelines are useful when actually adopting the API first approach. Well, your governance team, they can actually come into this team, to this API, and add specific guidelines which your API should adhere to. And every time your API doesn't, so if you say API you'll actually get an error. Right, so this way you can actually automate your entire governance process. But it doesn't just stop over here. You can actually collaborate as well. So again, transparency and collaboration is huge, especially when you want to catalog this internally and you want your developers using them. So you can actually invite different teams. So you can invite API architects, consumers, developers, all of these teams which you can define within SwaggerHub in your team management settings. And so these teams can then be given different permissions to come in, add work on this API, and also add feedback to the API. So full communication using team collaboration as well as SwaggerHub comments, which allow you to add a new method. Communicate in real time. So again, this was a quick overview of SwaggerHub, the entire design first approach. Let me share my screen again. So this is just a quick overview of what SwaggerHub can do, but more importantly, like why the design first approach is really important when you're actually adopting the API first approach. So my hope is, as we end this webinar, that the people who did take time out of their valuable time out of their schedules to attend this webinar actually had some good takeaways to take back to their workflows, to their processes, to their organizations, to their teams, and really start thinking about why the API first approach can be beneficial, how you can actually implement this API first approach, maybe get inspired a little from some of the things I mentioned in your company and process in your company, and finally, how the design first approach works. How do you actually use the OpenAPI specification to design APIs? Maybe how SwaggerHub actually helps fit in as well. But I really hope that people here got some good takeaways. You can always contact us at support@swaggerhub.com if you're a customer. You can follow SwaggerHub, the Twitter handle, because we're always updating that with some great articles, some great happenings in the industry, even our blog as well. And if you're an existing user of SwaggerHub, you can go to our help section as well to learn more about some of the features. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ryan and see if we have any questions.
Thank you so much, Keshav. Yes, we did have a ton of questions that came on, and thank you everyone for staying on the line. We had a lot of questions that came through, so we'll do our best to answer as many as we can here. One of the ones that came up a lot was the use of the mocking feature within SwaggerHub, and kind of what are some of you touched on it a bit, but what are some of the main use cases for using mocking within SwaggerHub? Where does that really come in?
Yeah, good question. I mean, so let's actually go back to SwaggerHub. I'll show you a quick example as well, if you can. New share. Right. So we're back into SwaggerHub, and the whole purpose of mocking is to really give people an idea of what the API does even before the implementation is created. And now the SwaggerHub mock is very basic. So over here now the mock is enabled. You can actually try it out. If you execute, you'll actually get some responses, right? And this is just a static response. It's not dynamic. It's not stateless, right? So the mock we have in SwaggerHub is very basic, and that is really to facilitate further development and keep all the internal stakeholders in sync with what the API does. So from here, based on this mock, your backend developers can go in. They can go in and download the backend code. We allow code generation over 30 languages. So say, for example, you're building it in Node.js, they can actually build out the Node.js backend. Your front-end teams can actually start building out SDKs for different views, different mobile devices potentially, and all of them know what the API does with the basic mock over here. Now, of course, if you want to do further mocking or like further virtualization of sorts where it can be more stateful, it's more configurable, and it's also more powerful with more dummy data that you can put in, then we recommend a tool called Service V, which is also offered by SmartBear Software that integrates directly with SwaggerHub, that allows you to actually further go about your virtualization. But the mocking here is just to facilitate that initial push for your front and back end teams to be interdependent of each other.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that question. We will get to a few more questions here. While everyone's still on the line, we'll probably go a few minutes over, but if you can stay on, that'd be great. We are just going to launch a quick poll within the webinar. So if you are interested in hearing specifically about any of our tools we've talked today, SwaggerHub for design, Ready API for testing, API virtualization, or any or all of these tools, we'd love to hear from you, and we'll make sure we follow up with some information and help connect you with the right person. One of the things that came out was around 3.0 was around when do we feel like, there were some questions specifically to our tools, but there's a broader questions around all of the tools that are out there, API management platforms, other tools of when we think they'll be supporting OpenAPI 3.0. Could you maybe talk a little bit about what you see as maybe when we could expect some of these tools to be offering support? I know the spec has only been out for a few months now. So
yeah, good question. I mean, it's more tooling vendors should get on the bandwagon soon. I think we are expecting more support for OAS 3.0 come 2018 Q1. You should hopefully see more API vendors supporting OAS 3.0 by end of Q1. Again, I can't speak for them because I don't work in their organizations, but that's what I'm guessing should be the case.
Okay, awesome. And someone just asked again, said that earlier in the webinar you mentioned a resource for setting up an API style guide. What was that publication called again?
Great. APIstylebook.com, APIstylebook.com.
Awesome. For people looking to generate their documentation from the Swagger UI in a format that's not HTML. Are there options out there for doing it as a Word or PDF? I know that's not something I don't think we have in SwaggerHub. But
yeah, I don't know, honestly. I'm gonna feign ignorance over here. I honestly have no clue about whether or not you can do that.
Okay. Let's see. A few questions came up during the webinar around testing. What do you view as the role of the OpenAPI specification in testing your APIs? Obviously that's a pretty broad topic, but maybe you could speak to, does the spec help in that regard? I know that since we're talking about an API first approach, obviously testing is a part of that. Maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, quickly though, the whole reason why Swagger or the OpenAPI specification is really powerful for someone who's actually in the testing phase is, again, they can actually start writing test cases against the specification itself and not against the implementation logic. Now, this is powerful because now, again, in the past, how it used to be is, you would have to have your backend developer, your backend developers would actually start working on the API and the API logic, the code of the API, and then the front end, and then the testers will start testing that API. As they test though, the API is going to keep getting updated because the backend team are going to be adding more code. And this way the testing team will actually have to come in and add more test cases or update their existing tests, and it becomes a huge process and hard process. And not to mention like the documentation team, which is stuck in between to like document all those new changes, it becomes incredibly hard. So what the OpenAPI specification does for testing specifically is it keeps everyone in sync. It auto-generates the documentation. So every time you actually update the specification first, you auto-generate the documentation from there, so the testing team knows what changes have happened. And also, though, the testing team is not really reliant on, I would say, the backend team directly to write their test cases. They can actually look at the specification itself, start writing test cases against that specification, not the code that's associated with that specification. So this way, it becomes a much more faster approach. It becomes less reliant on human beings, which who tend to be not reliant really, and overall makes for a much more collaborative and process with more communication between them.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I think we probably do have to wrap up here. I will touch on just a few things that came up during the webinar. One thing was around support for CodeGen in SwaggerHub for OpenAPI 3.0. I don't know that we necessarily have an exact timeline that we can share at that time. I do know it's something the team is working on currently on the open source, and typically we then quickly will bring that into SwaggerHub. Your best place to find out about something like that would be on the Swagger blog. And you can go there and subscribe, and you'll be the first ones to find out when that's added. I know it's something people are really looking forward to seeing within the Swagger platform and the Swagger family. On the other side of things, people are asking a lot about kind of a more visual editor, right? We hear that a lot in terms of defining your spec outside of the editor. That is something that is in the timeline, and we expect that out in early 2018. And we hope that you'll continue to share that feedback. Keshav shared some great resources here of how you can find more education, how you can get some more help. We do encourage you, if you have specific support questions, to reach out at support@swaggerhub.com and on the SwaggerHub blog, where we are always sharing good information. We will be sharing a recording of today's webinar as well as a copy of the slides. We're going to make sure that we try to get that out as early as we can tomorrow, knowing that a lot of folks here, if you're based in the U.S., you may be going on the holiday weekend or celebrating the holiday this week here in the U.S. So we want to make sure we get that out early. And we thank people who joined in from all over the world today. We had more than 500 people on the line today for today's webinar. So it was really exciting to hear so many great people sharing their insights, asking questions, and attending. So thank you for attending. Keshav, thank you so much for today's great presentation. And we look forward to staying in touch and hearing more about how you're building APIs with SwaggerHub and OpenAPI. So thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.